We want to spend some time here comparing checklists, instructions, and rating scales in comparison to each other, yes, but also in particular in comparison to a rubric. So checklists are what we want to look at first, and the word pretty much defines itself, but our definition here is a list of specific characteristics with a place for each one of those characteristics for marking if it is present or not present in a particular student's submission of an assignment. That's the only purpose of a checklist, is that list whether things are there or not. So it breaks an assignment down into specific pieces, and again, a student's submission as to whether those pieces are there or not. Clarifies what's required in an assignment, and so again, a checklist is a good thing to have or to present to students beforehand to give them a list of your expectations of what you want in their submission for this particular assignment. Not necessarily what's going to be graded on, just everything that is supposed to be included in their submission. And if you do choose to use a checklist for grading specifically, then it's much easier to use than a rubric, mainly because the decisions are just not as high end of a decision to make. And the checklist, this is true that it's easier for students and teachers for them to, again, know what's expected and to put those expectations in the assignment, because it's just whether they're there or not. And so it does make it easier for both teachers and students if a checklist is used, but if you're using a checklist for grading, you're not getting very deep into a learning objective or a standard or whatever it might be that you are specifically trying to determine whether the student has learned something or not. And that's why we use rubrics. Other examples of a checklist. Here's one from our book, maybe for kindergartners to begin developing their sentence construction. And so we want to make sure maybe for kindergartners that they begin with a capital letter, begin their sentences with a capital letter, that the sentence ends with either a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point. The sentence is a complete thought, and the sentence has a naming part or subject and a telling part or predicate. And so that really is just a checklist. It's whether those things exist or not within the student's submission of that assignment. Another example is a research paper checklist. This example has a checklist for a research paper in multiple categories here. The general category, my paper is, number of pages, whatever was in the instructions, it's typed, it's double, I'm just checking to make sure I have it in the order when I stapled it together, title page, outline. This is a very detailed, long checklist, obviously beyond the kindergarten level that we were just looking at, but I wanted to give you multiple levels of examples here. And so there's lots here. But this is still not a rubric. This is still not what we're grading the assignment on. This is just a checklist as to whether these things are here or not. We haven't gotten into the depths of whatever the topic of this research paper is. And so you just need to understand the differences there. Okay. Also within checklists, they can be used as a possibility, again, before the student actually submits their assignment, as a peer review process. And so they could partner up with somebody, you check my paper, I check your paper, and we go through the checklist and just make sure that somebody else is looking to see if all those things exist within what the student is going to submit. And so you're just partnering up on that. Just an example. Partners go through that checklist. You could even include a thing on there to where that checklist has a kind of a signature line at the bottom, and the other student that's checking it, a little accountability here, is signing off on it, saying that yes, everything is in that submission of the particular project. Could be added to the top page. So when The assignment is given out, again, when the rubric is looked at. So instructions, checklist, rubric, when all of that stuff is looked at before the submission, before the student has really even started working on the project, it could be included as a top page or the front page of a rubric for the assignment, for the students to go through and check off those items. Again, making sure that they hit the expectations of what the assignment asks for. So those are checklists. Looking at instructions. Instructions are the link between the checklist part and the learning objectives for the assignment. And so the instructions kind of link those things together. The instructions need to be explicitly clear in everything expected in the submissions from students. Everything needs to be written there. Don't make any assumptions whatsoever. And this is especially true if you teach online. Online, those instructions, those written instructions need to be very, very clear for students. Okay? Do your best, especially if you've given this assignment in the past, you kind of have seen some previous student submissions and you know what some of those mistakes are. And so you can make those instructions even more clear by kind of saying, don't do this within it, but maybe written in a positively written way. It should include, the instructions should include the checklist. It should include the rubric. Okay, the instructions before, because again, we want to make those expectations of everything we're looking for this particular assignment to be very clear to the student. And then they should also include how to submit the assignment. Again, maybe I'm thinking a little bit on the online world here, but certainly true in a face-to-face classroom. But just let me use the example of online. How do I submit this assignment? Do I create it in Word and submit a Word document? Do I type in a text box to submit this? Do I create it in a PDF document and submit it? Just all those details of how do I actually submit this? Do I submit it in the LMS? Do I print it and submit it? How do I submit the assignment? Make it very clear. Again, part of this process also of making your instructions very clear means that you get a lot less questions, particularly in email, about how to submit this. Of course, there's an assumption there that students are actually reading the instructions, but the goal would be that you would get less questions about the details if you include them in the instructions. Our next item is rating scales. And so we want to look at an example of rating scales, and what we mean by a rating scale is a list of specific characteristics, so it starts out very similar to a checklist in terms of definition, that includes a place for marking the degree to which each characteristic is displayed. So the difference here is that it's not just a yes or no, so it adds a dimension to the whole checklist thing. Instead of it being just a yes or no, yes it's there or not, it includes a frequency. And so, is this happening frequently? Is it sometimes there? So on. Okay. So a rating scale is looking for how often something is happening, whatever you're asking for them to do. So for an example, let's say that they're giving a speech in class or a presentation, oral presentation within the class, and eye contact is one of the things in your rating scale. And so their performance as they do that can be measured in frequently, occasionally, seldom, or never has eye contact with the audience. So that's just one example of a frequency scale for a rating scale. This is an example out of the book, Figure 7.2, that lists some of those options there within using a rating scale. Okay. Here's another example, kind of looking almost like a table or rubric type form, but that's not what it is. It's just a rating scale. And so, again, this is an example out of our book on this assignment. This is for students to use. So this is for students to use as kind of a checklist before they turn their submission in. And so on this assignment, I successfully used the skill on, and so wrote the information into a correct equation. That very first skill listed there. Did I do that on all the problems? Did I do that on most of the problems? And so it's a kind of a self-check here going on. That's what a rating scale could be. And again, the frequency here essentially is the all problems, most problems, some problems, and none of the problems. And then it's broken up into the different skills over there in the list. So just an example of something that could be gone through for a lab, or really any multiple step process that students are being asked to do on an assignment. So here's what we want to do as we look through this. We want to compare the differences and similarities between checklists, instructions, rating scales, and then rubrics. And rubrics are the more full, more robust measuring tool here. And as we progress through the course, we want to make as many distinctions here as we can to separate rubrics as being that higher end tool for measuring learning.